Hello AP Econ, these are your notes for the week of April 13th. We're going to focus on units 3 and 4, and we're going to start off with aggregate demand and what shifts aggregate demand. The first shifter is going to be expectations. So for example, if consumers feel and firms believe that things are more optimistic, like the economy is doing good, aggregate demand is going to increase. They're going to spend more. But also, if they are more pessimistic, AD will decrease. Second one is changes in wealth. So if the real value of household assets rise, you're going to increase the AD. If they fall, you're going to decrease the AD. The third one is the side of physical capital. So, for example, if you have a small factory, it's going to cause you to try to make it bigger, so you're going to increase the AD. If your plant size or your factory size is already really big, it would cause it to decrease. The fourth example is fiscal policy. So fiscal policy are government spending and taxes. So if you increase government spending or decrease taxes, that will also increase the AD curve. The fifth one is monetary policy. So anything that increases the money supply will cause an increase in AD. So those examples would be open market operations, buying bonds, or they're also called securities, decreasing the discount rate, which is the interest rate that the Fed charges other banks to borrow money. Remember, you could also decrease the federal funds rate, which is the interest rate that banks charge other banks to borrow money. Or you could decrease the reserve requirement. That's how much money has to be kept in the bank and not loaned out. Now we are going to move on to things that shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. Take a look at your SRAS. Notice that it is upward sloping. Things that are going to shift it. The first one is commodity prices, or like those resource prices, those raw materials, whatever's used to make the product. So if the prices of things that are used to make the product fall, SRAS is going to increase. The second one is nominal wages. So if you're paying your workers less money, so the nominal wages fall, that means SRAS is going to increase because you have more money now to be able to produce your products. And thirdly, productivity. The more productivity that the workers become, they become more productive, SRAS is going to increase. So what I've drawn for you here is we have our AD and AS graph, and notice that it's in a recession. The LRAS is to the right of the equilibrium. And then I've also drawn your money graph. Notice that it has nominal interest rates on the axis, and your money supply is vertical, and your money demanded is downward sloping. So on this example, I went ahead and said we have a fiscal policy, so we increase government spending. What you're going to see there is you're going to increase your AD curve to fix this recession over here. When you increase the AD curve because of government deficit spending, you're going to go ahead and shift the MD curve to the right as well. When that happens, you're going to cause interest rates to go up. But now I want you to take a look at this graph, and you'll notice that it's in a recession. Let's say, for example, there is no fiscal or no monetary policy. Basically, what I want to know is how do we move into long run? What is our automatic stabilizer? So what happens in the long run is AD obviously does not shift because there's no fiscal or monetary policy, so SRAS has to shift. And in order to get us back into equilibrium in the long run, again, an automatic stabilizer is SRAS shifts to the right, putting us back into long run. Again, this is an automatic stabilizer. The reason why is because of wages. I want you to pause the video and think, do wages increase or decrease in the long run to get us the SRAS to the right? Wages had to decrease. Okay, to bring SRAS to the right. So again, you can move into the long run automatically, and there's how if you have no fiscal or monetary policy. Just remember, wages are flexible in the long run. They are not flexible in the short run. They are in the long run. Some other notes about SRAS and AD. Remember that AD, the other things that shift AD besides those ones I mentioned earlier, are going to be signic, C plus I plus G plus NX. So consumer spending, investments, that's business investments, specifically buying more factories or more materials, government spending, and exports, net exports, exports minus imports. So don't forget that all of those components do shift the AD, and that's GDP. And then we also have SRAS shifters. So SRAS shifters, one of those is any different negative or positive supply shocks. So if you have a negative supply shock, it is going to move the SRAS to the left. This could be any outside input that affects the SRAS. For example, say there's a big hurricane that comes in and it takes out the oranges in all of America and the world and the stock. So that would be a shock, and so it would shift it to the left. When you shift the SRAS to the left, that is also known as stagflation. Stagflation causes high inflation and high inflation and high unemployment, low GDP. You do need to also know the vocab of demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation is when AD is shifted to the right. So it's pulling it and we see high inflation, high price level. Over here, cost push inflation would be SRAS again to the left. That's stagflation because now we have high inflation, price level has risen. In this unit, we've also talked about automatic stabilizer and discretionary stabilizers. So an automatic stabilizer happens automatically. It happens right away. So for example, if we are in a recession, unemployment is going to rise. So we have an increase in unemployment automatically. So we have things put in place like unemployment benefits and food stamps, things like that for people out there. And the government does not need to make a new law. It's already in place. So in a recession, we have an increase in unemployment, and that will cause just automatically an increase in transfer payments from the government. So no new law, it just happens automatically. Discretionary stabilizers, those are new laws to be made. So we increase the budget and we spend more. So basically new laws had to be made for discretionary stabilizers. Crowding out, we're going to review quickly here. So crowding out is when you increase deficit spending. So that means AD shifts to the right. When AD shifts to the right and we're deficit spending, that we need a demand more loans. So here is the loanable funds market. Make sure you know how to draw that and that it's real IR. So the demand of loanable funds will increase. When the demand of loanable funds will increase, the interest rate goes up. And what we know about this is when interest rates go up, investment goes down. When investment goes down, AD goes down. So again, the increase in deficit spending crowds out private investors. They don't want to go ahead and invest. So that's going to bring our AD back down. It doesn't bring it down the entire way because it won't crowd out all the investment, but some of it will. So AD will then decrease. But overall, from the original AD, which is right here, AD will increase overall, but it'll be not as high as the original deficit spending caused. Let's look at that interest rate from the last problem. We showed that interest rate increases. Make sure you know that bond prices are inversely related. So bond prices will decrease when there's an increase in the interest rates. You will also need this formula for the multiple choice this week. Make sure you remember nominal minus inflation equals real. Now I've given you an example of how monetary policy will affect your loanable funds graph as well as your AD and AS. So in this example, let's say we did a monetary policy, we decrease the discount rate. If we decrease the interest rate, that will cause the money supply curve to shift to the right. When the money supply curve shifts to the right, that brings interest rates down. Remember, on the loanable funds graph, if we have more supply of money, that's also going to increase the supply of loanable funds. So you shift that to the right. That will also show the interest rates are going downwards. If interest rates are going down, that means investment goes up. And when investment goes up, AD goes up as well. AD shifts to the right. So this is how a monetary policy affects all of these graphs. Notice in our AD and AS graph that we see that GDP has gone up, so that means unemployment goes down because those are also inversely related. Let's also take a look at what shifts the LRAS. The two major things are a change in technology and a change in resources. And from last week, we should notice that resources could be the land, the labor, the capital, anything that's used to make a good. So for example, if we have more capital now, what happens in the long run? The LRAS will shift to the right, as well as the PPC will shift to the right. But that again is in the long run. Here we're going to talk about the multiplier. The MPC is the marginal propensity to consume. So you find that by you do the change in consumption divided by the change in income. And that's disposable income. Here's the MPS, that's the marginal propensity to save. And again, how you get that is the change in the savings divided by the change in disposable income. That's your extra income that you have. The investment or government spending multiplier is 1 over MPS. The tax multiplier is negative MPC over MPS, or 1 less than the government spending multiplier and negative. The negative just shows if you are increasing or decreasing the amount of taxes. If you do forget how to get MPC and MPS, MPC plus MPS equals 1. You can refer back to week 1's video, but remember, if you need a certain amount of money, like if you need 100 million, you're going to divide whatever the amount is that you're actually 100 million divided by the multiplier, and if you're actually spending it, you're going to multiply by the multiplier. Another formula you need to know is MV equals PQ. M stands for the money supply. V stands for velocity. That's how many your dollar changes hands, how many times your dollar changes hands. And then P is average price level. Q is the real value of all final goods and services. So this is real GDP. This side of the equation, if you multiply it together, that gives you the nominal GDP. All right, liquidity. Liquidity is when we're changing our money into, so basically if you're saying something is more liquid, it's actually more like cash. So it's converting into cash. Types of financial assets. So the 3 types of financial assets I'm going to cover today are loans. Those are examples of when the bank lends you money for like a house or a car. Bonds are the IOU, so I buy a bond, and then in return, at a later date, I'm going to get that money back as well as interest on there. And then stocks, when I own ownership into a company. Let's take a look at our last little section here is the bank balance. Notice you have a T-chart. You have assets on one side and liabilities, what the bank owes back or is liable for. Demand deposits are what you're going to focus on the liability side. The RR stands for reserve requirement, which is $10,000. The excess reserve, which is $30,000. Those are additional monies that the bank has that can be loaned out. And then the loans, which are already being lent out. So I want you to take a look at these 2 questions. Number 1 is, what is the reserve requirement? And let's just say, for example, a customer withdraws $5,000. What is the new RR and reserve requirement? And then what is the new excess reserves? So go ahead and pause the video and try to figure that out. The reserve requirement is 10%. How you figure that out is you put the required reserves, the 10,000, divided by the demand deposits, which is 100,000. If a customer withdraws $5,000, the first thing you need to do is take it out of the demand deposits, the liabilities, which leaves us with $95,000. Then you have to take it out of the excess reserve, so minus $5,000, because that's the extra. So in your excess reserves, you're left with $25,000. I'm going to erase the loans area just so that way you can see the numbers a little bit better. But remember, you don't have to have the full $10,000 in the required reserves because you only have to have 10% of which is in the demand deposits. So now the required reserves are no longer $10,000. Oops, let's erase that over there. The required reserves are now $9,500. 500, because that's 10% of the demand deposits. But that extra $500 compared to the $10,000 doesn't just disappear, it goes into the excess reserve. So you add 500 here. So your total is 25,500. So your new required ratio or required reserves are $9,500. And your new excess reserve is $25,500. They may ask you what is the initial effect on the money supply. There is going to be no change because the money supply just changed from hands. For example, those M0, M1, and M2, it just went from M1, which is the demand deposits, into cash. So it doesn't actually change the money supply. Not until additional loans are being loaned out. They may also ask you if they want to take out more than what is actually in their required reserves. What can the bank do? They can borrow money from the Fed or other banks. Money can be multiplied using the deposit expansion multiplier. So 1 over RR, reserve requirement. And again, banks make money off of making loans because they get interest off of that. So it's definitely beneficial for banks to loan out money. And remember, money gets multiplied, so initial deposit will actually lead to further growth in our economy. Take a look at this bank balance sheet. We see assets on one side, the required reserves, excess reserves, government securities. Remember, those are the bonds. And then you have loans. Liabilities, you have demand deposits and owner's equity. Go ahead and if you were writing this down, copy this down, cross out owner's equity because that has no relevance to you. So please write down the charts. That way I can give you the questions to answer. Here are the questions for you to answer. Number 1 says, what is the reserve ratio? Number 2 is, I, for example, deposit $100 into the bank. What are now the maximum amount of new loans that could be made? What is the change over time in new loans? And the demand deposits and the money supply. So think about where you're going to use the multiplier. Go ahead and try these out. Pause the video. I'm going to go over these first two. The reserve ratio is 20% because you take whatever's in the required reserve, the $2,000 over the $10,000, and that means that the bank has to keep 20% of what is in there. The deposit of $100, the maximum amount of new loans that can be made is 80 because $20, 100 minus 20, 100 minus 20 is going to give you 80 left because you have to keep 20%. So 20% of 100 is you have to keep $20 in, you can loan out additional 80. To find the change over time in the loans, you have to take a look at how much was loaned out, which was $80 originally. So here's the 80 times the multiplier. Remember, over here, right there, it's 1 over RR. So 1 over 0.2 gives a multiplier of 5. So 80 times 5 means the max amount of change of new loans over time could be $400. To find the demand deposits, you would just multiply whatever was deposited, which was $100, times the multiplier, so that's 5, so 100 times 5 will give you 500. The money supply changes based on the amount of new loans, so new loans out there. So money supply would just be the 80 times the multiplier, just like the loans, and it gives you 400, the same answer as the loans. I went ahead and redrew the charts so we can go ahead and take a look at bond prices and what happens if the Fed buys bonds. Here are the questions that I would like you to answer. So if the Fed buys $5,000 worth of bonds, okay, let me rewrite that, bonds, what will happen to the excess reserves, and then what will happen to the demand deposits? And as a result of that, what is the maximum change over time of the money supply? So remember, the Fed is buying bonds from this bank. For the first question, the excess reserves will be $5,000. Because what's happening basically, guys, is when the government buys the bonds, or the Fed buys the bonds, we go ahead and take the $10,000 out there. They give us $5,000 cash, so we move that into the excess reserves. The excess reserves turns into $5,000, and then we have $5,000 left of bonds to sell. They give us cash, and we give them the IOU. Demand deposits do not change. Basically, we're just changing what's the order. So again, the government securities, the amount of the cash the Fed gives us, which is the $5,000, goes into excess reserves, and then we only have $5,000 worth of securities left to sell. How you calculate the maximum change over time of the money supply would be using that deposit expansion multiplier, 1 over RR. So 1 over 0.2 gives you a multiplier of 5. Now, anything that's in the excess reserves can be loaned out. So the 5 times the 5,000 gives us an additional possibility of 25,000. That's if they loan out every bit. But sometimes they don't loan out all of the amounts. Just a little bit of last notes on some things that might help you if you didn't recognize on the multiple choice. What we've been doing with the keeping the required reserves and being able to loan out different monies, this is going to be called a fractional reserve banking system, when we have to keep a fraction into our banks and not loan out everything. The last question is, let's just say we reduce taxes on household interest earnings. Do you think that savings are going to go up or are they going to go down? Savings will increase. So, for example, if you can make money off of putting money into the bank. So you can make interest off of your savings. So if they reduce the taxes on household interest earnings, anything you make off of interest, then you're going to want to save more money so that way you can earn more interest on it. So if they reduce the taxes, that will help you out. I hope you found this video very beneficial and a review for you. If you have any questions, make sure you have the Zoom session sometime this week or message me on Edsby. Have a great day, guys.